Committee will come to order. I'm pleased to be joined by all four of our sitting Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioners this morning. I want to thank you all for being here to discuss the work of the Commission. As you all have heard, let me say before, the best Ferc is a fully seated Ferc, and I'm looking forward to quickly holding a hearing on Willie Phillips, President Biden's nominee, to fill the vacant seat on the Commission once we've received all the necessary paperwork. Now, although we had some of you before the Energy Committee fairly recently as nominees, it's been over 3 years since we've had the full Commission appear together before our committee. This morning, I look forward to hearing how the Commission is working through our nation's important energy challenges, and at the core, those issues are all balanced against affordability and reliability of electric services for all Americans and their businesses. I was pleased to see the Ferc and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, released their preliminary report last week focused on the electric grid catastrophe suffered by millions of customers in Texas and other states last winter. I know there will be a great deal of interest in what corrections are needed to avoid these types of massive outages in the future. The energy mix has been and is continuing to undergo a transition due to market forces, and weather patterns are changing, and we'd all better focus on solving for the challenges come with this ongoing transition. A common theme in recent events, from the extreme heat in California in August of 2020 or the extreme cold around the country last winter, is a failure to plan for adequate energy resources in the context of these changing weather patterns and generation portfolios. Having reliable power is not a nice to have for a superpower economy. We have to get this right. But we have a chance to balance the cost of reliability and resilience with affordability, because affordability is also not optional. There's a wide agreement that we need to address climate change, but less agreement on how fast and at what cost. In my view, the only way to do it is without sacrificing reliability and affordability, is with policies that spur innovation, not elimination. It makes no sense to take tools out of the toolbox because we know that none of these energy resources are 100% immune to weather disruptions, whether that be freezing wind turbines, disruption to our natural gas production and delivery systems, or frozen coal stockpiles, all of which we saw happen last winter. We have to maintain a diverse and reliable energy mix with the technologies necessary to reduce our emissions. Because when the sun sets in the middle of a regional heat wave, people expect grid operators and utilities to have firm generation ready to go, be that energy storage or natural gas. As we all know, Ferc has a very important role in regulating natural gas markets and the infrastructure that's needed to move natural gas safely and efficiently. We have natural gas to thank for the lion's share of the decarbonization we've seen in the power sector over the last 20 years, and natural gas has helped manage prices and reliability. We have vast reserves of this commodity right in our backyard that can continue to support our energy independence. In 2019, the Appalachian Basin alone produced an estimated 11.5 trillion, that's with a T, cubic feet of natural gas, helping America become a net energy exporter for the first time in 67 years. However, moving this gas to market safely and efficiently is a necessity. And in order to do that, we need to smartly expand the country's natural gas infrastructure system. According to regulators, pipelines have a 99.99% safety record, making them the safest mode of energy transportation. I believe that natural gas has an important role in the energy transition, and we need to ensure an efficient, predictable permitting process for pipelines. Congress expects FERC to update and revise its policies and practices in response to new facts and new technologies, and certainly court decisions, of course. But that's while following current law and current policies and processing application reviews expeditiously. I look forward to discussing how the Commission is balancing the need for updates with an obligation to the industry to provide fair and timely review of permit applications. With that, I'm going to turn to Senator Brasso for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding today's hearings, and it couldn't be coming at a more critical time, and I'm especially appreciative of your opening comments focusing on affordability and reliability of our energy. Because as we speak, this administration and House Democrats are working frantically to impose a witch's brew of reckless energy policies across the entire nation. The House Democrat plans will effectively end any new oil, natural gas, coal, and hard rock mineral production on federal lands and waters. If enacted, their bill surrenders America's energy independence and makes us dependent on OPEC, Russia, and China. It also would devastate communities across the West and the Gulf Coast. House Democrats also plan to impose a natural gas tax on American families and businesses. At a time when inflation is at its highest level since 2008, these policies make it more expensive for American families to heat and power their homes. Mr. Chairman, the magazine The Economist last week pointed out that higher energy costs anger voters and hurt the poor. Look, price increases, they increase inflation, they lower standards of living, and yet the House Democrats' plan would establish a so-called clean electricity performance program which will add to the costs of energy. It's a scheme. It would use an estimated $150 billion of taxpayer dollars to pay off the largest utilities in the country to deploy Democrats' favorite energy sources. At the same time, it will allow those utilities to charge their customers for new transmission lines to service these facilities. And to add insult to injury, Democrats do not plan to debate and consider the legislation through regular order. They won't even allow the public to provide testimony on their bill. Instead, they plan to ram it through the legislative process on a completely partisan basis. Not one Republican is going to support that bill. We won't support it because we have witnessed the disastrous results of these policies elsewhere. Let's look at California. California prematurely shut down nuclear, natural gas, and coal-fired power plants. They have richly subsidized solar and wind energy. Now the people of California pay some of the highest electricity prices in the country. In return, millions of California residents have been subject to rolling blackouts over the last 2 years. They're having a hard time trying to keep the lights on in California. It's so bad that the Secretary of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission have had to give California waivers. Waivers to do what? Well, to allow them to use natural gas plants to run overtime. We should also look at what's happening in Europe. Like California, European countries prematurely shut down their nuclear power, their natural gas, their coal-fired power plants, and what do? They richly subsidized wind and solar energy. Now Europe's electric grids are failing to deliver, and electricity prices in Europe are hitting all-time record highs. Recent headline in the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Chairman, here it is. European energy prices surge. What's the subheadline? Lack of North Sea wind curbs an electrical source just as stocks of natural gas are low. The article notes that this month, electricity prices in the United Kingdom, because of policy decisions made there, are 7 times what they were just 1 year ago. 7 times higher than what they were 1 year ago. Now, Europe doesn't have sufficient supplies of natural gas. This puts them completely at the mercy of foreign actors, including Russia. Make no mistake, this is America's future if President Biden and House Democrats get their way. For these reasons, I'm glad we have members of the Ferc before us today. Among Ferc's authorities is the principal regulator of natural gas and electricity, has the responsibility to ensure Americans have affordable and reliable natural gas and electric service. Mr. Chairman, the 2 words that you used to start your opening statement today. Ferc is an independent agency, not merely an arm of the White House. In other words, Ferc commissioners have the opportunity as well as the obligation to speak the truth about the potential impacts of these policies on all Americans. They can explain the consequences of the reckless policies to a president who seems intent on putting rhetoric ahead of the reality and the politics ahead of the people of this country. Welcome to you all, and I look forward to hearing your testimony, and a number of us have some probing questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And I'd like to welcome all 4 of our witnesses to the committee, and thank you for being here today. It's nice to see all of you in person, in one place, in one setting. So we have Chairman Rich Glick with us, we have Commissioner Mark Christie, we have Commissioner Allison Clemens, and we have Commissioner James Danley. Chairman Glick, we're going to begin with your opening remarks, if you will, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting my colleagues and I to appear before you today to discuss the important work we are doing at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I'm honored to appear before you for the first time since being designated by President Biden as chair of the committee at the Commission in January. And I'm also very glad to be back in this room where I spent so many hours as a staff person on a couple of different occasions. The nation's energy landscape is in the midst of a dramatic transformation driven by rapid changes in economics, technological innovation, changing consumer preferences, and the exigency of climate change. Residential, commercial, and industrial customers are increasingly demanding that their energy come from zero-emissions resources. Dozens of the biggest utilities in the country have established their own decarbonization goals, and a growing number of states and federal policies are aimed at dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Commission's job is not to pick winners and losers, but we do have a role in eliminating barriers to technology's participation in wholesale markets. For instance, over the last several years, Ferc issued landmark orders facilitating energy storage and aggregated distributed energy resources participation in organized wholesale electricity markets. Today, I will focus my remarks on 5 priority areas of our work. 1, building the transmission grid of the future. 2, modernizing electricity market design. 3, updating Ferc's natural gas certificate policy statement. 4, safeguarding the reliability of the electric grid. And 5, facilitating a more inclusive decision-making process. The rapid shift in the resource mix and the growing threat to grid resilience due to the changing climate require significant investments in new and existing transmission. In July, the Commission unanimously approved an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, inviting the public to comment on potential reforms to improve current transmission planning and cost allocation and generator interconnection processes. The aim of this initiative is to meet the transmission needs of the future at the lowest cost to consumers. Through the ANOPR, Ferc is taking a critical step toward our first major effort at transmission reform in a decade, and I hope to move forward as expeditiously as possible with this priority work. While organized wholesale electric markets continue to provide for lower prices, greater efficiencies, and increased innovation, these markets are now some 20 years old and in certain regards may fail to reflect the modern electric sector. One key focus is to address the growing tension between state public policies and administrative pricing rules. As states were adopting clean energy policies that shifted the resource mix towards renewable and zero emissions generation, the Commission expanded its minimum offer price rule in the Eastern RTO capacity markets in a manner that put state-supported generation resources at a competitive disadvantage. In response to strong concerns from the states, clean energy industry, and consumer groups, the regional grid operators have initiated stakeholder discussions to reform their capacity market rules to better accommodate state policies. In addition, the Commission generally relies on competition to establish just and reasonable rates in wholesale markets, but this only works if there's true competition. The Commission's vigilant use of its authority to prevent manipulation of electric and natural gas markets is an essential tool to ensure rates are just and reasonable. Under the Natural Gas Act, Ferc essentially must determine whether a proposed interstate natural gas pipeline is both needed and in the public interest before issuing the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. In 2018, then-Chairman McIntyre initiated a notice of inquiry seeking input into the potential reforms to modernize the Commission's 1999 Certificate Policy Statement. While the Commission received numerous comments at the time, no action was taken. Earlier this year, we issued another notice of inquiry seeking additional input, including options for determining whether a proposed pipeline project is needed, approaches for evaluating a proposed project's impact on climate change, and what considerations are required when a proposed project would be cited in an environmental justice community. The need to see this proceeding to a conclusion is even more urgent in the aftermath of several appellate court decisions highly critical of aspects of the Commission's approach to pipeline certification. As we have witnessed in Texas this past winter, the prolonged loss of electric service is more than just an inconvenience. It can and did produce tragic results. Ferc and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation are conducting a joint inquiry into the operations of the bulk electric system during Winter Storm Uri, and recently released an interim report suggesting a lack of weatherized generation and problems associated with natural gas production and processing were the main causes of the Texas blackouts. I am determined that the recommendations arising from this joint inquiry be implemented to avoid a reoccurrence of the events. Whether it is prolonged record cold, heat waves, drought, and wildfires in the West, or increasing ferociousness of hurricanes in the Gulf, climate change poses a distinct threat to grid reliability. The Commission recently initiated a docket to examine the impact of extreme weather on grid reliability. We will continue to focus on actions that utilities and others can take to address the growing threat of extreme weather. We need to be equally vigilant when it comes to potential cyber attacks against the grid. At Ferc, we use a two-pronged approach to safeguard grid security, employing mandatory standards to set requirements for foundational practices, while we work collaboratively with industry, states, and other federal agencies to identify and promote best practices. Given the high stakes, we devote constant attention to and continue to explore improvements in our cybersecurity. And lastly, Ferc's regulatory actions have a significant impact on the lives of millions of people. As a result, it is important that our decision-making processes include robust input from diverse perspectives. That is why I am pleased the new Office of Public Participation is up and running. I want to commend my colleague, Commissioner Clements, for her leadership and her hard work in helping to establish the office. Toward the goal of inclusivity, I want to highlight FERC's efforts to better incorporate environmental justice and equity concerns into our decision-making. It is unlikely that FERC is hearing from members of historically marginalized communities with the same force and frequency as other stakeholders, and thus it is essential that environmental justice and equity get the attention in our decision-making processes that they deserved. Thank you again for the opportunity to share some of the Commission's priorities, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Glick. And now we'll have Commissioner Mark Christie.
Coming on.
You're on. You were on.
Oh, I am on? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, the red light didn't come on. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, it's truly an honor to be here for the first time as a member of the commission. It was just over 1 year ago that I appeared before you as a nominee, and I want to thank you for all the courtesies that this committee gave me a year ago. I said then that my two highest priorities, and I think FERC's highest priorities, are maintain the reliability of the electric grid and also make sure that costs remain affordable for consumers. And I want to mention, Mr. Chairman, you made those same comments in your opening statement, so I want to mention something I think that's relevant to that. As you know, you asked me about this last year, and as you know, I spent 17 years as a state regulator in Virginia. And as a state regulator in Virginia, I learned an awful lot about your state, Mr. Chairman, West Virginia, because we share jurisdiction with Appalachian Power Company, which is the largest utility in West Virginia, certainly in the southern half of the state. West Virginia has a generating fleet that is 90% coal. If West Virginia is forced during the transition that we're going through to prematurely retire that entire fleet, number one, you've got a reliability problem in West Virginia because 90% of your generating fleet is coal. But secondly, you've got a cost problem because that fleet has to be replaced with replacement power, and West Virginia consumers have to pay for that. And secondly, most of those generating units in West Virginia I'm familiar with are in rate base. And what that means is if you shut them down, West Virginians are going to be paying for them for years to come, even though they're not operating. So as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, we're going through a transition. We're going through a transition to a lower carbon future, and everybody wants to get there. But as we go through this transition, it is absolutely essential that reliability not be compromised and that consumers not be exploited. And with that, thank you again. I appreciate being here, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Christie. And now we're going to hear from Commissioner Allison Clemens.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. It's quite an honor and an opportunity to have to testify before you today. For several decades, the Commission has met its responsibilities under the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act by adapting to reflect changing circumstances. These circumstances include technological advancements, shifting economic and market dynamics, the emerging cyber threat, and evolving federal, state, and local energy policies. While the Commission's adaptation to change is familiar, the current magnitude of challenges driving the need for this change is unprecedented. My testimony today describes 3 priorities the Commission should pursue to protect customers while facilitating a reliable and resilient energy system. First, we must safeguard the energy system against extreme weather. Members of this committee in particular understand the suffering and the issues posed by excessive heat, drought, and wildfires in the West, increasing frequency and severity of hurricanes in the Gulf Coast and up the eastern seaboard, and unusual heat domes and extreme cold around the country. Current policies are not adequate to meet these new realities. Of course, the issues cannot be boiled down to just a reliability standards problem, or just a transmission system planning problem, or just a market design problem. As FERC and NERC staff described in the preliminary findings from the February Storm Uri event, we must address extreme weather holistically to ensure reliability and resilience. The Commission has appropriately opened a docket examining challenges posed by extreme weather, and I will urge Commission action based on what we learn in this record. My second priority is ensuring FERC's regulations better facilitate construction of cost-effective high-voltage transmission infrastructure. Action here is a priority for 2 reasons. First, as was affirmed in the initial analysis of Storm Uri, as well as in earlier polar vortex events in 2014 and 2019, linking grid regions together via high-voltage transmission continues to pay reliability and resilience dividends during extreme weather events. Second, The U.S. transmission system is not equipped to integrate resources that otherwise outcompete existing ones and meet consumer demands for clean energy. Declining costs of wind, solar, and hybrid generation, which make up the majority of the new supply seeking to connect to the grid, are not translating into the customer benefits they hold the potential to provide. The reason? Outdated and often unworkable transmission planning, cost allocation, and interconnection policy. Current planning happens generally in a piecemeal fashion based on analysis that is not sufficiently forward-looking to protect customers. The result has been inadequate system build-out, leading to overloaded interconnection queues and project development delays, and of course the costs that come along with them. Failure to act on this priority will further endanger both customers and broader system reliability. The Commission's recently issued advance notice of proposed rulemaking is a critical step to examine how holistic, forward-looking planning, based on a more accurate assessment of future conditions, can avoid such outcomes. It will provide an important record from which to take action. My third and final priority is to modernize the Commission's interstate gas pipeline certification approach to protect the public interest and increase regulatory certainty. I am eager to achieve a legally durable framework for considering certificate applications under the Natural Gas Act, one that achieves balance by providing consistency and regulatory certainty to both project sponsors and the public that we are pledged to serve. The Commission's outstanding notice of inquiry on updating our 1999 policy statement provides a record to consider the perspectives of stakeholders across the energy sector towards this goal. While we are considering this record, however, we cannot ignore our responsibility to implement our existing policy statement consisting with binded appellate court instructions, going back to 2017. The D.C. Circuit's recent vacatur of the Commission's decision granting Spire Pipeline certificate demonstrates the harm that may befall project sponsors and consumers when the Commission's decisional process falls short. As part of this effort, I have prioritized improved public participation in Commission proceedings. The Chairman spoke about the Office of Participation, a congressionally directed office which is intended to do just that. It has been the greatest honor to begin service to the American people, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now we'll have Commissioner James Danley.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, thank you for having us here. I'm going to begin by talking about a few items within the Commission's jurisdiction that I'm particularly concerned about. The first is our authority to certificate pipeline infrastructure under Section 7 of the Natural Gas Act. The purpose of the Natural Gas Act is to encourage the development of plentiful supplies of natural gas at affordable prices. And a handful of actions that the Commission has taken recently have created such a climate of uncertainty that it has stultified the ability of pipelines to rationally deploy capital or secure financing. In our utility system in America, we rely upon private enterprise to deliver essential services, and the business consequences to these jurisdictional entities are profound. We've had a couple of cases that have thrown real doubt into the certificate process. One of them apparently seemed to reopen to litigation the terms of a closed certificate. You have to understand the consequences that can have. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to operate and construct a pipeline, and people will not finance projects of that size if they think that the certificate terms are up for later relitigation. Another problem has been the hints that have been dropped in our generic proceedings, and in another case that we could condition the certificates that eventually do issue on some form of mitigation. And that, of course, has yet to be seen what form or shape that would take or what the cost would be and how they'd be imposed. And lastly, the pipeline industry has witnessed seemingly inexplicable delays in the processing of the NEPA documents, the National Environmental Policy Act documents that we're required to make, in which the Commission staff has determined that EAs, that is the shorter environmental assessments, were not sufficient, but full EISs were required. And what I think causes the pipeline companies confusion is that at least in 2 of the cases, the EISs, the full reviews have come out, and they reached the exact same conclusion that the shorter environmental assessments did. All told, these different actions of the Commission have caused such uncertainty that just last week, a very small pipeline project, it was upgrades to compressor stations in Pennsylvania and Virginia, the application was withdrawn because FERC had not taken action on beginning the environmental review. So I just want to highlight to the committee that it is critical that we have stable processes in place. Otherwise, financing will not be available, and this infrastructure that's needed. Remember, as we learned sadly in Texas, if the gas system goes down, so does the electric system. People rely upon this infrastructure, and it needs to be developed in an orderly manner, and there has to be stability for that. I'll briefly touch on two other points. I'm concerned about our authority under the Federal Power Act to set rates for electric transmission. There is at this point a great deal of enthusiasm for a rapid build-out of transmission in America, and doubtless there are places in which further transmission development is necessary for reliability, to reduce congestion. Those are legitimate and appropriate reasons to be building transmission, and those costs rightly go to the consumers who get the benefit of that transmission build-out. But in the enthusiasm that people have to bring intermittent resource generated power from remote locations where it's produced to the load centers of urban areas where it's consumed, I am gravely concerned that the value proposition set forth of getting inexpensive renewable energy may be illusory in the end, because if the cost of the power is cheap but the cost of the transmission is high, you will see in the end possibly all-in bills to the ratepayer, and it's the ratepayer that ultimately bears all of the costs of the transmission system. The all-in bill to the ratepayer may actually be higher than it would have been had locally produced electricity been employed. We are constrained by unambiguous court precedent to have a cost causation system in which the benefits derived from the transmission that the ratepayers are charged for is roughly commensurate with the cost they have to pay. And as we look at our generic proceeding for transmission, the Commission has to bear that in mind because it's a fundamental of transmission rate making. And then lastly, very briefly, I see I only have 30 seconds left. I'm concerned about resource adequacy, specifically resource adequacy in our jurisdictional markets. The RTOs and ISOs have delivered immense benefits to ratepayers, but for those markets to work, they have to be designed properly, and I'm concerned that incorrect price signals in our markets are failing to get the resource adequacy necessary, that is to say, the actual quantity of generation of the right type to ensure system stability. And the Commission has to ensure that these markets are competitive so that the price signals are accurate and guard against the exercise of market power. And I'm 2 seconds over. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and I appreciate it. Now we're going to start with the questions, and I'll start with the opening questions. I'm going to ask all four of you the same question. If you were rating yourself on how you all work together looking for commonality between 0 to 100%, how would you rate yourself? Chairman?
I would rate us 80, 85. I mean, we have our differences, but I
Okay.
think, I think we respect each other.
Chairman Christie?
Well, I taught for a long time, and great inflation's real, so I'm going to say 90.
I'm going to try and turn my microphone on. I think we're at 80, 85 and just getting started.
There's always one. I'm not sure it's quite that high. Certainly from my standpoint, I am very concerned about the clear, unambiguous letter of the law and the court's interpretation of it. And so there are times in which I will admit that I can have a very clear-eyed view of that. But when it comes to the discretionary actions of the Commission, I think we get along very well. And I'll point out that 95% of our orders are unanimous. So for the vast majority of the work we do, we're of one mind.
Very good. Thank you all. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over the last 12 months, the Consumer Price Index for energy has increased by 25% overall. That includes increases in natural gas, electricity, gasoline, and fuel oil. Right now, the benchmark Henry Hub natural gas prices are more than twice as high as a year ago, over $5 per million BTU, an annualized rate equal to $109 billion of increases to the consumers, the end users. As I said in my opening remarks, affordability is not an option. I'm concerned we're on a one-way rise. So all of you want to comment very briefly on how does FERC take inflation into consideration when carrying out your authorities and determining what is reasonable? Quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. FERC has authority over the regulation of electricity wholesale markets, for instance, and electric transmission and natural gas transportation, but we don't have authority over fuel prices, whether it be oil, whether it be natural gas. And we take our job seriously in terms of regulating electricity markets to make sure, as much as we can, that they're sufficiently competitive and the rates that have resulted are just and reasonable.
But nothing moves without electricity.
That's correct, absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I think in every case we do, we have to be very, very sensitive to the cost to consumers because what FERC does affects retail rates. And,
Correct.
And that's what flows through to monthly bills. So I think cost has to be uppermost in every proceeding.
I think the two things we can do are plan ahead to save customers money and also encourage competition, non-discriminatory competition.
You all can just leave your mics on that. We don't have to click them
In the-
on and off. 'Cause-
Thanks.
Okay.
In the jurisdictional markets, the costs that rise because of inflation are inputs to the offers that are made by market participants, and the contracts that are negotiated by utilities are, as between them, they're jurisdictional to us, but they negotiate their own contracts.
The other question I'm going to have is based, I mean, I know it's concerning Texas is the poster child that we're using, but basically those decisions are all over our country, you know, on gas and how it's produced and how it's needed, and electricity to run the gas, on and on. But FERC's interim report on 2021 winter storm indicated Texas and south central U.S. are heavily reliant on natural gas for fueling electric generation to meet peak capacity and energy needs. At the same time, the natural gas infrastructure is heavily reliant on electric power for producing, processing, and transporting natural gas to end users. As we all saw, a relationship was managed in February in a way that failed consumers drastically. Have you all been thinking about gas-electric coordination for years? I know that's been going on, and we know that you all have been talking about it. Why haven't we solved the problem yet? Why is it taking so long to get that integration done? I'm going to start and go down either way.
We have been talking about it for years. In fact, the last concrete action we took, I forget how long ago it was, but 2016 perhaps, was to implement NASB standards to get the day-ahead scheduling fixed between the two. This is extremely esoteric material for a lot of the mechanics of the interaction between the two of them, but it's a subject that we're constantly concerned about, and we're working on it actively.
We have two important dockets open, Chairman Manchin, that will provide more information to allow us to take further steps on this interdependence. One is the docket on extreme weather and climate change, and the other is the open inquiry on our certificate statement. So it is in the works. When we think about Texas, whether it be in Texas, California, New England, across the country, the Gulf Coast, we have to think about planning, market design, and reliability standards. We can't just fix one of them. They all fit together.
Mr. Chairman, the gas-electric coordination has been an issue for years because we have such a large percentage of our generating capacity in gas, and so that's absolutely a high priority. I would say in Texas, and I've said this before, I think the problem in Texas, and again, it's their issue to work out. They're not under FERC jurisdiction as far as their rate design and their energy market. I think an energy-only market where subsidized resources are going to always win and non-subsidized resources are not going to win is going to lead to an imbalance, and I think that's what happened in Texas. Weatherization, of course, was an issue, and the gas plants needed to be weatherized. Mm-hmm. But where's the money going to come from? The gas producers have to have an incentive to weatherize, and they've never had one in an energy-only market. So I think the bigger problem has been exactly the way the market's designed. But again, that's for Texas to figure out. They're not under our jurisdiction.
I understand that.
So, Mr. Chairman, two issues. One, with regard to gas-electric coordination, it's my opinion that the Commission has been too deferential. We've only approved changes that actually both the gas industry and the electric industry could agree with. I think we actually need to bring the two sides together and kind of knock heads and suggest we really need to make some changes here. Secondly, and most importantly, while we have reliability standards for the electric industry, we don't have reliability standards for the natural gas industry, including pipelines. I think it's something Congress needs to seriously take a look at because we saw what happened in Texas, and the consequences obviously are very severe.
Let me just say, I'll just take privilege of saying making a statement, don't have to have a reply on this, is that the people are concerned about getting product to market, okay? So getting gas pipelines has been tremendous challenge. They believe that FERC has, not the people I hear from, believe that FERC hasn't been very clear in the past of how they go by this process, knowing up front what to expect, making sure that they don't run into one thing after another that's added on after they make their request for their permit. I'm hoping that you are getting your act together on that, have clarity to it, what you expect, boom, 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 so they can get it done, or reject it. Either way, let them know up front. And the biggest thing I hear all the time, how in the world could we as a country support Russia building a Nord Stream pipeline in Europe, and we basically denied the pipeline coming from Canada? And has that caused a problem? Because the product is still coming to the market. You can talk about that later, but I'm just telling you what complaints I hear all the time. With that, we'll turn to Senator Barrasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on some of those sorts of things. And with Commissioner Christie, You know, at the present time, you're the only commissioner who actually has direct experience overseeing retail electricity supply and sales. What's likely to happen to electric reliability if Congress enacts this so-called Clean Electricity Performance Program to force the closure of natural gas and coal-fired power plants, the plants that generate electricity even when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow? For example, just consider a region like PJM, which used to be Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, but is now 13 states from the middle of the country to the Atlantic coast. How do they keep the lights on without natural gas or coal-fired power plants?
Well, right now, PJM couldn't. They're 20% coal, I think about a third gas, and 38% nuclear, so they couldn't keep the lights on. My concern about any kind of national mandate that with deadlines and timetables is that the deadlines and the timetables for how you change the generation mix doesn't fit the reality of the facts. And as the Chairman said at his beginning, as we go through this transition, which everybody wants, this lower carbon transition, it's absolutely essential to keep reliability uncompromised. And NERC has warned that if you inject intermittent resources, which of course wind and solar are two examples, if you force intermittent resources at a higher percentage than the system can balance, and you don't have reliable dispatchable resources, gas, coal, nuclear, you have a reliability problem. And NERC has warned about that repeatedly. So my concern about a deadline for when you have to have a certain percentage of a certain generation mix is it doesn't fit the actual technology. Today, we don't have the technology to have a 100% emission-free grid. We don't have that technology. So a deadline of 2030 or 2035 essentially is a gamble that the technology is going to develop. We want the technology to develop. So the question really is, what's the best way to do it? I personally think the best way to do it is to pour money into research and development, but that's not my call. But if you mandate deadlines that can't be met based on technology, you're going to get reliability problems.
So you addressed one of the two comments that the chairman raised at the beginning of the committee hearing, reliability. Now I want to ask about affordability. Commissioner Christie, what's going to happen to electric bills of our constituents if Congress forces states to rely almost exclusively on intermittent wind and solar? And won't this just drive costs, especially if we find, as Germany has discovered, that we must have backup natural gas coal-fired power plants?
Well, a national standard, of course, is going to treat different states differently. We have 50 different states. Each one has a different generation mix. Right now, the generation mix is totally under the control of those individual states. So it affects individual states differently. I'm very familiar with Virginia because I was a state regulator for 17 years, and I'm very familiar with West Virginia because we share jurisdiction with their largest utility. As I said in response to the chairman's opening, West Virginia is 90% coal. If a national standard forces West Virginia to shut down 90% of their generation mix, you obviously have a reliability problem. That isn't hard to figure out. But from a cost standpoint, West Virginians have to pay for replacement power. Paying to replace 90% of their generation mix is going to be extremely costly. And also, West Virginia happens to be a vertically integrated cost-of-service state. That means those generating plants that would be forcibly shut down by a national standard are in rate base. And so West Virginia consumers are going to pay for years to come, even though those plants are not running. And the same thing applies to Virginia, my state. Our largest utility, Dominion, has numerous combined cycle gas plants. If you forcibly shut those down, Virginians have to pay for replacement power, and they're also going to pay for the plants, because I can tell you they're all in rate base. So different states are affected differently, but for states that are heavy on dispatchable resources like gas, coal, nuclear, it could potentially have a very heavy impact, certainly on cost.
Thanks so much, Chairman, Mr. Christie. Mr. Danley, today's Wall Street Journal editorial, Climate Policy Meets Cold Reality. It's an op-ed. Climate Policy Meets Cold Reality. In it, the author points out that Europe's rush to renewables is causing prices to spike and energy shortages. So you got both. You got reliability and affordability issues. The author concludes, she says, Europe offers a portent of the havoc to come under the Biden administration's policies that aim to shut down fossil fuel production and power the U.S. grid exclusively with renewables. So if Congress enacts this so-called Clean Electricity Performance Program and it severely restricts natural gas production, as the House Democrats are proposing, will we be headed for higher prices and energy shortages both?
Thank you, Senator. I think that it's almost inevitable. I typically don't think it's my role to comment on the legislation before Congress, but in this case, I want to be responsive to your question. The markets that we have, which are organized markets, ISOs and RTOs, they cover about 2/3 of the population of the United States to deliver their power. These are mechanisms that we have very slowly refined incrementally over the course of decades. And this, the text of the bill, as I read it, seems to create an incentive and penalty structure that would absolutely change and frustrate every settled expectation we have for these slowly developed, incrementally produced markets of ours, effectively dropping an H-bomb into the middle of them, and it will effectively end the markets as being anything other than administrative constructs, perhaps for the purpose of balancing and dispatch. I just, if you'll indulge 1 minute here, imagine how hard it would be when you get a capacity supply obligation, which, you know, some are 3 years ahead, they're 3 years forward, and you got that supply obligation in return for a payment when the market cleared, and your further bids that you make in later auctions are going to then have to not only have you figure out what the cost is, but also what your competitors who are bidding in, what their new calculus will be based upon performance metrics that have not even been achieved yet. I can't imagine how the markets could possibly take that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And now we're going to have Senator Heinrich.
Well-planned transmission projects tend to create net savings for customers. In fact, NREL's SEAM study found that for every dollar invested in transmission, ratepayers tend to see more than $2.50 in benefits. One of the challenges, however, is that the perceived distribution of benefits can be quite uneven to various customers across the regions served by transmission projects. So I wanted to ask each of you, does FERC currently have the tools it needs to allocate transmission costs equitably across multiple regional beneficiaries? Mr. Glick, why don't we start with you and we'll just go down the line.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich, for the question. So the answer is yes, we do have the authority. As Commissioner Danley mentioned earlier, we are required by the courts to ensure that benefits are roughly, or that the cost of transmission is allocated in a manner roughly commensurate with benefits. But I think sometimes we look at benefits way too narrowly. So for instance, if someone receives power from a particular transmission line, you're considered a beneficiary. But as you pointed out, transmission opens up congestion. It allows you to get access to cheaper power. Certainly it enhances grid resilience and reliability. And there are a significant number of benefits I think we need to take into account. That's what we're looking at in our ANOPR process right now.
Ms. Clements, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And I think it's important to put a human face on the statistics that you just mentioned. In the Midwest, in the 2010 to 2012 period, the region got together and made a significant investment in transmission called the multi-value portfolio lines. To this day, in the cold weather Uri event, those lines were protecting customers and keeping the lights on. A decade later, benefits that were never considered at the time that those investments were made. Smartly planned transmission brings resilience and reliability to benefits to all customers across all states. It also provides the opportunities for low-cost resources to bring down customers, not just in states with policies promoting those resources, but again, across states.
So your point of view is we should be considering things like reliability as a value that transmission brings.
Yes, sir. If we do not, we'll find ourselves in a position 10 years from now where the lack of interconnection between regions, between states, is going to cost customers a whole lot of money.
Lengthy timelines for projects that have been stuck in interconnection queues are one of the primary barriers to deployment of new clean sources of energy. Particularly in wholesale markets, PJM, ERCOT, others. A Berkeley National Lab study from May of 2021 found that in 4 ISOs, the typical duration from connection request to actual operation went from 1.9 years back in the 2000 to 2009 timeframe to about 3.5 years for those built in the last 10 years. What can FERC do to help make RTO ISO interconnection processes more efficient so that we can get more energy deployed faster to meet these challenges?
So thanks for the question, Senator. So I think what you said is exactly right, and the queue delays we have in this country are far too long, and they're obviously causing issues. I think we need to do a couple things. First of all, we need to marry up our transmission planning process with the interconnection queue process. Right now, they're disjointed, and that's causing the queue process to take forever. Secondly, I think we need to look at the way that network upgrade costs are allocated. Traditionally, what the Commission has supported is a situation in which the generator connecting to the grid has to pay all the upgrade costs when there are a significant number of beneficiaries, as we just talked about elsewhere. And so that's actually slowing down the process. Sometimes these upgrade costs are so expensive, it's causing generators in the interconnection queue to drop out at the last minute.
Senator, one thing we need to do is, I guess the general term is queue reform, but the numbers of projects in the queue is not the total picture, because of all those projects in the queue, some are ready to go, some are not. And so I think that the queue needs to start taking into account which projects already have a state certificate, which projects already have a PPA, a purchase power agreement with the seller, so they're already financeable, and start prioritizing which projects are, to coin a phrase, shovel-ready, and which ones are not and still don't even have financing. So I think queue reform includes prioritizing the ready projects against the not-so-ready projects.
Thank you, Senator. I would add to those two comments that we need to have states at the table in the conversations, and we have set up a joint task force with NARUC, the Association of State Utility Regulatory Agencies, so that we can start having conversations about some of the really difficult siting issues, which are one of the main delays to getting transmission built together outside of contested proceedings.
I think that one of the easiest things that the Commission can do is stop issuing unlawful retroactive waivers of the queue deadlines, which are the means by which markets actually manage their queues. That would be simply us not doing something unlawful, and that would be an easy partial fix.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. Commissioner Danley, I'd like to start with you. Senator Barrasso referred a few moments ago to the Clean Energy Performance Program. Which would require increasingly massive amounts of our energy to come from low-emission sources. Presumably, a lot of that coming from intermittent sources like solar and wind. Now, these types of energy projects often require costly new transmission lines to be built to connect the generating sites, which are, of course, many, to the consumers. Can you explain to us the cost impacts that this might have on consumers? In other words, how might consumers be affected by a proposal like the Clean Energy Performance Program?
Certainly. So consumers will be, I would predict, affected in two ways. The first is the cost of transmission is going to go up drastically because the amount of wire you're going to have to string across the country to bridge those distances between the remote locations where intermittents are and the load pockets is going to be very expensive, and that will go directly into the customer's bills. But the other thing that's going to happen is there's going to be a reliability consequence. As the markets fail to produce correct price signals as a result of these new incentives and penalties, they're going to fail to accomplish the resource adequacy goals that the markets have taken over from the states. And when that happens, this isn't some obscure, part of market design. This has a real-world consequence that when we fail to have resource adequacy properly achieved by the markets, then the lights don't turn on when you need them to. And we've seen this happen in California in the not-too-distant past, price signals failing to get the right resources.
So as we're building these big projects, a small handful of people will make a fair amount of money off of it. It sounds nice. In many ways it is. But you're saying customers will pay higher prices.
I believe they will.
They will also pay for it in terms of diminished reliability.
Yes, that's hard to predict specifically, but actuarially speaking, there is greater risk.
Reliability is certainly something that Ferc is charged with looking at, and therefore something we ought to be concerned about. Now, Commissioner Danley, in its review of natural gas pipelines, the Commission may be delaying issuance of certificates of public convenience and necessity due to disagreements of what fits within the statutory definition, within the meaning of reasonably foreseeable. What's the appropriate standard that you think the Commission ought to use in making these determinations?
So I presume you're talking about how, under our NEPA review, we determine what the significant impacts on the human environment are for our EISs and EAs. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
So what we're required to do under the implementing regulations for NEPA is review all, take account of all of the significant foreseeable effects in the human environment. And in doing so, there is you'll appreciate this, a Falls graph style proximity question. How easily traceable?
Foreseeability and
That's right,
causation.
exactly. So if something is not foreseeable in that kind of tort scheme, then it just doesn't fall within the compass of the required review.
Is that the case where all the explosives, the fireworks went off?
Yes.
There's a big backup? I
Yes.
read that in conjunction with the wagon mound case. Haven't
That's right,
thought about
exactly.
that one in a while.
Yep.
Okay. This is something I'm concerned about, because if in determining this, if you get that wrong, either in pursuit of an environmental agenda or otherwise, you could be sacrificing other things that the Commission is charged with overseeing, including things affecting price and things affecting the reliability of the grid. Commissioner Christie, there's been vocal support for the creation of one or more Western Regional Transmission Organizations, or RTOs, as they're sometimes described. Under an obligatory RTO, could consumers in previously independent markets, who then become part of that obligatory Western Regional RTO, could they face increased prices due to the renewable energy portfolio commitments made by other states, not made by their own elected representatives in their own state?
Well, Senator, if I understand your question, let me just first say, I think the decision whether a state should go into an RTO is purely up to that state. I don't think Ferc should mandate it, and I would hope Congress wouldn't mandate it, but it should be a state decision. And all the RTOs in America are different. I spent 17 years in PJM. That's very different from California ISO. So the details of how an ISO or RTO operate are going to be worked out, within that RTO. One of the issues you've got in a multi-state RTO like PJM, I know from experience, is you're trying to mesh, you got 13 states in DC in PJM. Trying to mesh those public policies is always a challenge, and you've always got a threat that consumers in one state are going to end up paying for the decisions of politicians in another state. So if the Western states like yours want to join an RTO, it should be their decision. I would just say, look very closely at the details before you make that decision.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, welcome. Thank you for being here. Chairman Glick, let me start with you, and if the panelists have any further comments on this, I would be interested to hear it. This summer in Nevada, we actually experienced the harmful impacts of jet fuel shortages, particularly at Reno Tahoe International Airport. And there were multiple factors involved, including the increased volume of air travel, the strained supplies at airports throughout the West. This resulted in airlines limiting the number of passengers so that they could fly in extra fuel rather than refueling locally. So my question to you is, as commerce returns, what actions is FERC taking to help reestablish normal access to fuel among the different transportation sectors? And then what more can Congress do to assist FERC in preventing future shortages?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Senator. And so we did experience some issues this past summer, incorrectly so, in Reno. And the reason is, historically, in terms of our regulation of liquid fuel pipelines, sometimes when there's more demand than the supply in terms of capacity on the pipeline, that pipeline capacity is allocated out based on historic use, based on the previous year's use. And because the airlines didn't have significant demand for jet fuel for the previous year because of the pandemic, the airlines actually got caught in a situation where they were allocated less fuel than they had been in the past, and demand for flying increased, especially in terms of certain airports. They ended up short, and they had to bring in jet fuel by truck and so on, and there weren't enough truckers and so on. So it was a difficult issue. I think this issue of historic use needs to be addressed. I raised it as an issue at a technical conference we had earlier in the year. I think we need a different approach to allocating capacity because of the different anomalies, and you have my commitment that we will take a look at that and hopefully act before next summer's demand peak.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And then to the panel, as we are all aware, the drought in the West is not letting up. If anything, it is getting worse. It's going to be our norm. And as a result, the Energy Information Administration recently released a report that found that U.S. electricity generation from hydropower is expected to drop 14% this year compared to the year 2020. So from your perspective, how can FERC better account for drought in future efforts to ensure grid resiliency and sustainability? And I'll open that up to the panel, if any panelists have any comments on that.
I'm happy to start, Senator.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the question. The answer to that question is to plan, understanding that the impacts of extreme weather events, the continuing excessive heat to be expected now in the West, the impact of that heat and that drought on our hydropower reserves, is to plan ahead to address that. I think it's really important that we live in the nuance of the facts of the energy transition, which we find ourselves in the middle of. Variable energy resources like wind, solar, and other emerging technologies are proven to be reliable resources. That is real experience in normal operating conditions. SPP has 80% penetration of wind and solar. It's this extreme weather change, the impact that stresses the system in ways that we haven't had to plan for in the past, that is the issue to be addressed. And that's why I think this advance notice of proposed rulemaking that the Commission has put forward to think about how we better predict the resources that will be available will take us safely through to the other side of the energy transition.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I would just say, Senator, we have authority over the reliability of the bulk power system, and one of the things I think we need to take a look at is requiring utilities to plan for, as Commissioner Clements mentioned, plan for climate change. We can't expect the generation's always going to be there, and it's not just hydropower capacity. It's other power plants freezing during very cold weather or malfunctioning because of very hot weather, and utilities need to take that into account as they move forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie?
I think it's what the question you asked, Senator, illustrates how absolutely important it is when you plan for resource adequacy that you accurately document what is the capacity you're likely to get from resources. And that's been an issue in all the RTOs, is you can't plan on getting more actual capacity than is realistic. And that goes to why planning, which is absolutely essential, you're right, has to be accurate about the resources that you're going to expect to get.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you all for your continued service. I want to be able to follow up on a conversation, Commissioner Danley, that you brought up earlier about the environmental impact statements versus the environmental assessments. This has been a question from multiple different individuals and groups within my state on trying to be able to figure out the certainty of where things are going on that. Is there something you need to be able to finish out in that statement? You raised that earlier on that.
No, I think I made my point from before. I'm merely concerned that in some perhaps misbegotten desire to ensure that our orders are legally durable unnecessarily, because basically I think that we have been able to deal with most of the alleged legal infirmities that have been raised by my colleagues on our EAs and EIS, or our EAs specifically, as we have for years, and have withstood every challenge in court by addressing those comments in the order, right? The record of decision, which is the consummation of the NEPA process in the case of Ferc, is actually the initial order that we issue. And I don't think that it's necessary to go through the process of producing EISs that come to the same conclusion that the EA did.
Right.
We can handle those comments.
Chairman Glick, this is an ongoing issue as well, just the predictability of the process so that people, when they're planning capital, know that they're actually going to be able to do investment at a time based on what they already received. How do you balance that out?
Absolutely, and I think you hit on the key word, certainty. The court has been, the D.C. Circuit has admonished the Commission on 3 separate occasions just with regard to our examination of greenhouse gas emissions. We actually didn't review those emissions. We didn't review the significance of those emissions. And the court said all 3 times, we're sending the case back to FERC. It causes extra delay. We've seen that in a bunch of other cases. You look at the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is probably the poster child for this. And this is a different agency, the Interior Department. It got it wrong in the previous administration. The court sent it back, added several years and extra billions of dollars onto the process.
So with that, are you assuming that all orders in the future are going to be EIS statements? There won't be EAs at all?
No, I think we still go forward with some EAs, but if there's any question as to whether there is significance of greenhouse gas emissions, the law requires us to do an environmental impact statement instead of an EA.
So you think that's going to be closer to the default then?
No, I think what we're going to do, hopefully pursuant to this notice of inquiry process that's been initiated, is set up a particular standard below which a certain number of emissions, and I don't know what that is, obviously all the commissioners have to agree on that, below which I think projects can go forward with environmental assessments, above which are significant, and then we're going to need to consider other issues pursuant to an environmental impact statement.
How will you handle social cost of carbon scoring, or will that fit into this?
Well, we're waiting for guidance from the CEQ on that, but the court in the Vecinos case that was just issued recently suggested the commission needed to at least take a look at the social cost of carbon as whether, in terms of assessing whether the greenhouse gas emissions.
Clearly, when you get into social cost of carbon, you get into lots of different models from lots of different places. The people that typically write the models for social cost of carbon have a certain view as well of what they're taking into account on that. As an independent body, how are you going to be able to manage what is the right scoring for social cost of carbon?
Well, there is a level of uncertainty, and the Vecinos court pointed that out recently, but we do actually have to take that into account, and we're waiting for guidance again from CEQ, but as an independent agency, we're going to have to make our own judgment pursuant to a majority vote of the commission.
So this is not an assumption that this is going to come down from the administration and hand you, here's the way to be able to handle social cost of carbon.
Now, the commission has historically tried to follow CEQ guidance on NEPA reviews as much as we can, but no, we have to make our own determination.
So, Chairman Glick, let me just stick with you this. Ferc trying to be able to issue the revised pipeline certification policy statement. There's been some conversation about this. When do you think that comes down?
We're reviewing. We received a large number of comments. We're reviewing it. I was disappointed. You know, we started this process back under Chairman McIntyre several years ago, and the commission never moved it forward. So we're trying to move it forward now as quickly as we can. I'm hoping within months, but don't have an exact timetable for you just yet.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Christie, I want to be able to drill down on something on the issue about large transmission lines. Obviously, you've dealt with this a lot. I've brought up multiple times the Transwest transmission line. There's lots of other ancillary issues there, but they've been 14 years in process just to do the permit, and they've not put up a tower yet. There's been a lot of push on having us at 100% renewable in the generation field by 2035, 14 years away from that. Is that a realistic time period just based on the permitting process to be able to transmit power from long distances and intermittent sources?
Well, the problem, Senator, is this with these long-distance transmission lines that go over multiple states. And I've sat on many transmission line cases and actually voted for the longest transmission line in PJM today, the trail line, Trans-Allegheny. The fact is, when you cross 5 or 6 states with 300 or 400 miles of a 765 kV line, they're going to have tremendous opposition. That's just political reality. And so you're not going to get many of those permitted, and it's not because of any conspiracy. It's just the political reality that people don't want. You're going to have a tremendous political backlash. It's very hard to get these interstate lines sited. The important thing about transmission is this. If a transmission line is needed, then it ought to be built. If it's needed to serve reliability, then it ought to be built. And I think, frankly, the people in each state are willing to accept transmission lines. There are going to be controversial, I can tell you. I've sat in high school gyms and been yelled at by people that didn't want to look at a transmission line. But people will accept if they think that their state regulators have done right by them, had a good record. But I think, though, that politically, if you try to run a line across 6 states, I think that it's going to be much harder politically to get those cited, and people are not going to really accept the fact that a line like that is needed, particularly if it's only going to benefit a special interest group.
Great, thanks. We'll follow up with questions for the record. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair had to run to another committee, and so I'm helping and calling on myself, which I'm next in the queue. I do want to thank the chairman of Ferc for mentioning the Market Manipulation Authority and the advantages that that's given, and thank Ferc for its uses over time. I do think it's really helped in policing the market. As we discuss this larger issue of transformation and where we need to go, I want to point out that GAO did a 2021 report that said the impacts on the grid will cost utilities and consumers billions without more significant resiliency investment. So doing nothing is going to cost us, and we see that all the time. I mean, this research now that just says electricity lines sag in hotter temperatures and cause fires, and the fact that we could make them more intelligent than they are. The lack of capacity caused lengthy interconnection queues, top 750 gigawatts in 2020. So there we are with basically congestion that could be resolved. We know in Spokane, when we had this heat wave, which was record heat for the Pacific Northwest, we had the electricity, we just couldn't get it to the right spots at the right places. And so this is going to occur more and more. And what's happening because of this is we are now having the increase in electricity costs for consumers because we haven't met these demands or missed the rural economic development opportunities or the job opportunities. So for me, but again, I'm not apologizing. I just come from a very, very rich state reliant on electrification. And it's paid the bills over and over and over and over again. And so I'm just a big believer in electricity and the investments that we can make that make our economy more robust. So we know we now have a rapidly electrifying transportation sector. Ford made this big announcement today, how they're going to go with even more electric vehicles, which would mean roughly 25% more electricity than we are producing today. So we know that this is where we're going. So we have to have a grid that is going to get the job done for the economy of the future. So I'd like to discuss a couple of issues. One, this notion of installing fiber on top of transmission towers. Not only is it an affordable way to transmit massive amounts of data, which I think you need for that automobile sector or smart grid sector or application sector. I've often said this is like the operating system of the future. And if we invent it and we work on it, and I guarantee you, and it's basically driving down cost and giving you more options, everybody will want it. So to me, it's as unique as what Ben Franklin contributed. And I hope that we will continue to lead in electrification technology. But encased fiber 40 feet in the air surrounded by high voltage transmission lines, pretty secure against physical attacks. So a great concept that, but it also provides a closed loop network for cyber communications, which we also know, given the Colonial Pipeline and everything else. This is just unfair to say that we're going to have a simplistic answer to cybersecurity when now utilities are being attacked from state actors. These are sophisticated nation actors taking aggressive action towards us. Why? Because this is where the money is. This is where the intimidation is. This is where the economy of the future is. So you can do a lot of damage really simply. And so I would like to, there's a lot that lighting up dark fiber and building out OPGW along our nation's transmission grid could improve data needed to modernize the system and make our grid more secure. So I'd like to start. Do you, Mr. Chairman, agree that expanding communication capacity around the grid's existing right-of-ways could help provide benefits for cybersecurity, grid modernization, and high-speed internet, and that a program maybe that's a grant, loan, cost share, EEI has basically talked about this. There are examples in the chairman's state, his own state. There is great examples of utilities and telcos working together. I know in my state, some of the public utilities and people are working together. They see the future of the grid, and they're trying to capture that. So what does FERC have? What do we need to do to build out that capacity for the future?
So, Senator Campbell, I agree with you completely. I think this is fiber provides a significant number of benefits in terms of, you said, cybersecurity, certainly bringing out broadband. But I want to point out one other issue. We talk about building transmission. We need to build a lot of extra transmission, but we also need to make our existing transmission grid more efficient. And one of the ways we make it more efficient is operating the grid a little more dynamically. And in order to do that, we need significant amount of additional data points as to where the transmission lines are, and are they sagging, are they, depending on weather changes and other changes to the grid. And we're not going to be able to do that, to operate it more efficiently and more dynamically without that particular data. So it provides a significant benefit to have that fiber optic capability as well.
Thank you. I've even heard that people say you'll be able to hear fire on the lines if you had this kind of system in place. And to me, if you could detect, instead of what we've gone through in California, where you either have to preliminary shut down for days and days in advance of a big temperature burst, or on the after effect. To me, having a smarter grid just to deal with fire, it would be a big benefit. Okay, Senator Marshall.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to all of our guests today. I just want to make sure you all are feeling the same pain that Kansans are feeling from the economic cost of the February winter events. I hope that you can feel the same pain that we're going to feel for a decade. An average family home like I grew up in, 3 bedrooms, two baths, natural gas, probably about $80, $90, $100 a month. That cost was $2,500 for February. And what they're going to do is take that over the next 10 years and let people pay off that debt. probably will double the average Kansas family's natural gas bill for the next 10 years. And it feels like we're just piling on when it comes to energy costs. We're already paying 40% more at the gas pump. And as the chairman indicated earlier today, the cost of natural gas is more than doubled since this administration has taken over. So certainly the cost of energy is just through the roof. Some small businesses in Kansas, Sugar Creek Beef Packing, typically pays about $24,000 a month, and they got stuck with $600,000 that month. So it went from $24,000 an average. You're making a business plan, you get a $600,000 hickey. A homeless shelter in Kansas, usually paying about $2,000 a month. $2,000 a month, their bill for February was $48,000. This little city of Mulberry, not to be confused with Mayberry, but the little city of Mulberry typically pays about $2.50 a unit. They were charged $330 a unit, a 13,000% increase. 13,000% increase. City of Winfield, municipality, they're typically a monthly bill, $130,000 a month, $8 million. An $8 million surprise for them. You know, the people of Kansas want to know, what is their senator doing? And Ferc would be one of my resources. So I'll start with the chairman, and kind of multiple questions here to try to answer together. I think what the people of Kansas want to know is, who made the money? Who made all that money on that increase? What has Ferc done about it? Is there an investigation underway, and what would be a reasonable timeline for the people of Kansas to know the truth about this? Was there price gouging, and who made the money?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. I first say the impacts were horrific, and that's we need to think about these types of situations where there are shortages and what happens in terms of prices. And I want to start with jurisdiction. We don't have jurisdiction over the price of the sale of natural gas. Congress deregulated that a number of years ago. I believe it would be helpful if Congress were to, whether it give Ferc or some other agency some sort of circuit breaker authority when there's extreme prices, to impose some sort of limitations at certain times. I think that would be helpful. But secondly, as you mentioned, we do have authority over the manipulation, or to guard against the manipulation of both our electric markets and our natural gas markets. We've entered into a number of inquiries with regard to alleged manipulation that occurred during the Winter Storm Uri. Several of them, we found a number of anomalies. Several of those particular anomalies, when we investigated them, we moved them on to what we call our investigations office. So we're moving forward. It takes a while, unfortunately, because we have to go through a lot of data. We haven't made any final determinations yet, but I can assure you that to the extent that we do find that there was manipulation, we will make sure that...
Who made the money, and what's a reasonable timeline?
I can get you a list of individual companies that reportedly made a significant amount of money. In terms of the timeline of the manipulation investigations, I don't have a specific timetable for you, but we're moving as quickly as we can.
Months, years?
I'm hoping months.
Yeah. Mr. Christie, you've been on state and federal level now. Who made some money in these events? Is it the pipeline? Is it the people that are selling the natural gas at the pump? Not specific companies, but who benefits from this? A 13,000% increase. Somebody got rich.
Well, as the chairman said, that is the situation from February is under investigation by our enforcement division, and so I don't want to comment on that investigation. Your question about who makes the money, it could be traders, it could be suppliers. It depends on the facts of the situation, and what happened in Kansas and Oklahoma in this past February, of course, as the chairman says, under investigation. I think a bigger issue, too, that needs to be just considered as background is, again, as we go through this transition to a different resource mix, lower carbon, gas has got to be part of the mix, and that means gas supply has got to be plentiful, and gas supply has got to be transported. You've got to transport a product before you can use it, and so that gets to the market availability of gas. But as far as the manipulation of this intense shortage that we had in February, that's definitely under investigation, needs to be investigated, and see whether there was manipulation that drove those, that took advantage of that very tragic situation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank all of you for being here today, but also for your service. And just as Senator Marshall was pointing out, you guys are right in the crosshairs of a lot of the most difficult decisions that are going to happen over these next few years. I brought an audio-visual, really just a visual, It's out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and shows basically the extent of our clean energy resources. The blue is the wind, the yellow is solar, and then the green being the green light, is where you've got both. But you can see that these are states that are Democratic, Republican, really cover a large portion of the country. I think this represents a unique opportunity to be able to reap the economic and employment benefits of making this work. But we only are able to make this work if we link our resource supply to our energy demand. And obviously, a lot of the questions you're all getting today are on this. Chairman Glick, if Congress had the desire to enable more transmission build-out, could the creation of a new federal siting authority for transmission be an effective policy that would help enable that goal?
So there are three general barriers to transmission development in the U.S. One of them is siting, one of them is cost allocation, and the third one is planning. We have jurisdiction over the last two. We don't have much jurisdiction over siting. If Congress were to create some sort of siting body, that would certainly have some benefits in terms of pushing transmission forward. But I would say we also have to address planning and cost allocation as well in order to get it right.
Right. I think we agree. And while we're talking, Mr. Glick, the U.S. was able to successfully take advantage of the innovations in hydraulic fracturing and this so-called gas revolution. And part of this was because of the federal siting authority in terms of gas pipelines. Natural gas pipelines clearly propose different environmental, human health, aesthetic challenges than transmission lines. Is it therefore appropriate for a hypothetical transmission siting authority to potentially have correspondingly different guardrails and protections for both states and landowners than our existing gas authority, while still maintaining its integrity, enabling the build-out of new transmission?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I think there is. I think there certainly are differences. There's a lot of similarities in terms of citing the two technologies as well. I would say, though, we need to learn from the mistakes that the Commission has made from the past about ignoring certain parties, not facilitating greater participation in our proceedings, ignoring what's required under NEPA. We need to do that, whether Congress does that or the Commission does that itself in a new transmission siting authority. I think we need to learn from that and do better the next time.
Right. And Commissioner Christie is a former state regulator. What's your sense of this?
Thank you, Senator. My sense is the states are not the reason that the lines are not getting built. I know we hear a lot of rhetoric about how the states are the barriers. They're the ones in the way. I will tell you one of the first transmission line cases I'm aware of when I went on the Virginia Commission was a line that ran from West Virginia down into Virginia. It was a 765 kV large line. And it was delayed for almost 2 years. And it wasn't because of the state commissions. We approved it. West Virginia approved it. It was delayed because of federal agencies. There were 3 different federal agencies, Army Corps, Forest Service, and there was one more, Fish and Wildlife, and they were delayed for various reasons. It wasn't the state commissions. And so I think the idea that, well, if you just get the state commissions out of the way and create federal authority, you can just get all these lines built. I don't think you change the political dynamic. That the reality is, again, as I mentioned before, I've sat in high school gyms and been yelled at by hundreds of people that didn't want to look at a 500 kV line. And so you're going to have that same dynamic even if you go to federal siting. In fact, I think you're going to have less political support for building those lines because they can all blame the Washington people, right? It's harder to blame your own state officials, and you're from Colorado. It's a lot easier, you know, if the Colorado Public Utility Commission approves the line, it's going to have a lot more credibility than if somebody in Washington says, build that line from Pueblo down to Albuquerque.
Right, or from Wyoming out to California. That's
No, exactly.
A case in point. So, and I'd like to ask either Ms. Clements or Mr. Danley if you've got any additional perspective or suggestions in terms of how we can make more efficient these siting necessities.
Thank you, Senator. I mean, there's political realities to any kind of significant infrastructure investment, whether that be on the gas side or the electric side on the issues within our jurisdiction, and those political realities will be different in all cases. The only way we succeed in building out the transmission system to integrate all the resources that are trying to connect and provide customer benefits to protect against the impacts of extreme weather and the events that need that strengthening of our system is to get buy-in from the parties around the table, whatever that line might be. So it would be great to have other tools in our toolbox as a commission, but we can have all the tools in the world if we don't have buy-in that this is an important thing that the country has to get done to maintain our leadership across the world, frankly, going forward.
Mr. Danley, you want
No, I have nothing to add to my colleagues on this. Thank you.
to, that would be the mythical alignment of self-interest.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here today. It's good to have you in the room. Ferc is inherently an economic as well as safety regulator. Your mission, as given by Congress and explicitly summed up on your website, is to, and I quote, to ensure economically efficient, safe, reliable, and secure energy for consumers. This means that when you are looking at approvals for pipelines, for hydro facilities, LNG terminals, your chief view is to make sure the projects are safe and they economically benefit the consumer. That's a really important mission. When Montanans go to turn on their lights or heat their home in the wintertime, they expect that they are delivered affordable and reliable energy. Unfortunately, Democrats in the U.S. House are trying to pass their tax and spend bill that would include provisions that would kill jobs and increase consumers' energy costs. Their bill includes new methane taxes and fees, as well as increasing the royalties on oil and gas development. In fact, the new methane tax alone is estimated to increase energy prices for consumers by $100 a year. That would be a tough hit for many of our low-income and fixed-income families across Montana. I have a question for all commissioners, and that's this. Looking at it from Ferc's economic viewpoint, and knowing that consumers use natural gas in their homes, in fact, 40% of the U.S. electricity generation comes from natural gas, would you agree that increases in taxes and fees on natural gas production, transportation, and storage will increase consumer energy prices and would have a negative impact on low-income communities? Would you agree with that? Let me ask you this, would anybody disagree with that? So is silence that you would agree that it will increase prices?
I
for
think
consumers?
price increases would be inevitable, yes.
Okay.
Senator, if I may, we regulate the transportation of natural gas. We obviously don't regulate natural gas, produced natural gas, the prices that for sale. But I would say that certainly that if anybody's costs go up, then their tax costs will go up, then their rates will likely go up. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one measurement. It depends how competitive the market is, what other opportunities there are for other sources of energy, for instance, that might be less expensive and so on. So it's a little bit difficult to say that without knowing what the market is going to look like.
And sir, I would add that, one thing that comes to mind from the extreme weather event in February is the fact that the pipelines performed pretty well. The issues that happened were related to the weather, lack of weatherization or failures due to freezing at the wellheads, at the production level, and down on the generating side. And so when you think about how to make investments that are prudent relative to customers, thinking about reliability standards in other areas, some of which fall outside the Commission's jurisdiction, are important.
Okay. Well, I think there's a consensus. You raise taxes and fees, natural gas, ultimately the consumer is going to end up most likely paying more. Chairman Glick, many members of this committee wrote you a letter in April requesting the status of over a dozen natural gas infrastructure project approvals and asking the Commission to quickly process these important projects. As of today, how many new natural gas pipelines are currently waiting approval?
How many new proposals for natural gas projects? If I can get you that for the record, I don't have an exact number, but a significant number. But there's
Yeah, what's your best estimate? I respect the fact you want to get the exact number. What's your best estimate?
I'm going to guess in the neighborhood of 150 projects, including LNG projects and gas pipeline certificate projects.
150.
I'm gonna guess.
And we've heard that approvals are taking longer, and we're seeing what's going on right now around the world. In fact, just in the last 48 hours, spikes in natural gas prices as related to the fact that the wind stopped blowing in the UK. Do you think this could, by delaying these projects, could this have an effect on price?
So a couple points, Senator, and thank you for the question. First of all, the situation in Europe and in Asia, yes, there are certainly increased price pressures, and a lot of that has to do with their reliance on LNG. And the fact is that they had a very hot summer and a very cold winter, so they haven't been storing natural gas. So they have low supplies of natural gas, high demand. It's obviously going to increase prices, and it did increase pretty dramatically. In the U.S., we have a much different situation. We have our own. We're not heavily reliant on LNG, except for in terms of exports, but not in terms of imports to supply ourselves. And so I don't think you're going to see similar price pressures.
Yeah, it's just remarkable to me as I'm watching the dynamics here in Washington that we have increasingly more Democrats that are on the bandwagon of stopping more natural gas consumption, which I didn't think we'd come to that point in this country, but I think it's a real threat to reliable and affordable energy in America. I want to switch gears here and talk about hydropower. Commissioner Danley, in Montana, approximately half our electricity is generated from affordable, reliable, renewable hydropower. I believe that we need to continue to expand hydropower throughout Montana and the United States by streamlining and expediting hydropower permitting. With my support, Congress actually streamlined permitting for small hydro projects, but I believe there's a lot more we can do. Question is, what ways do you think Ferc and Congress could help expedite the approval and the development of new hydropower facilities?
So thank you for the question, Senator. We have been, every chairman that I have worked either under or alongside has wanted to make the hydro process more speedy and clear. One of the problems, and I think it's necessary to set expectations here, is that our authorities under Part 1 of the FPA are pretty broad-ranging, and the number of inputs that go into a hydro project are huge. We have resource agencies, we have various communities and stakeholders that need to have input on it. We have the state and local authorities. And so there is no doubt that there are efficiencies that can be gained in the process, but they are complicated projects that have tremendous potential for destruction of property or loss of life. So deliberate hydro processes are probably called for. The best way to improve it would probably be the inputs from the federal agencies, because often, I know I'm saying that FERC does things faster implicitly here, but often federal agency inputs are the problem. And streamlining that process to get the single choke point to get the information from the resource agencies could help a great deal.
Thank you very much.
Senator King.
Well, I can't resist because you suggested one of my favorite mottos of business, which is you always want to have one throat to choke. And what that means is somebody needs to be responsible. So I appreciate your comment. It's a life principle that I've lived by for some time. Mr. Chairman, first I apologize for being late. We're having another hearing on Afghanistan and in the Armed Services Committee. We have artificial intelligence, but the inability to schedule Senate hearings so that there aren't conflicts. I'm gravely concerned about cybersecurity of our pipeline system. And as you all know, the pipeline system is not really under your purview explicitly, and yet it is really, in my view, part of the grid. In New England, over 60% of our electricity comes from natural gas, all of which comes through the pipeline. So if there's a compromise, a cyber compromise of the natural gas pipeline system, our electric grid is down. And so I'd like to ask the chair and other members, if they're interested, how do we deal with this issue? I've met with the pipeline industry. They're taking steps on this, which I appreciate, but I always follow President Reagan's admonition, trust but verify, and I'm not sure we have sufficient verification of the cybersecurity of the pipeline system. Any of you that want to comment, but I'll start with the chair.
Thank you, Senator. And I want to start by saying I very much agree with your statement. The natural gas sector and the electric sector are still heavily reliant on each other for reliability purposes. And on the electric sector, as we know, we have mandatory standards, mandatory reliability standards. And that's not necessarily,
But that's my point.
Yeah.
You have great standards on the grid side,
Right.
but not on the pipeline side, and yet they're integrated.
Exactly. I know Senator Cantwell and you, Senator King, and others have been leading this effort for a number of years, pointing out that the TSA has authority over pipeline cybersecurity authority and not FERC, not the Department of Energy. And former Commissioner Chatterjee and I actually wrote an op-ed about this because it's a serious issue. And I think TSA, to their credit, at least now is actually considering.
So what should we do?
mandatory standards.
Do we need to change the law?
I think we need two things. We need, I think, first of all, TSA needs to move forward with their mandatory standards, but even more so, as I think I said this earlier, we need to consider mandatory reliability standards for the natural gas pipeline industry, and that includes cybersecurity, but other standards as well, because we saw what happened in Texas. When there's not similar standards on the electric and gas side, we see some of the issues that occur. And I think Congress at least needs to consider whether TSA is the appropriate agency, whether there's another agency that could do a better job in terms of imposing mandatory cybersecurity and reliability standards in the pipeline industry.
Could you supply this committee with your recommendation to help guide our deliberations on that subject?
Be glad to do so, Senator.
I think this is an absolutely urgent question. Any other members of the commission wish to comment?
Senator, I think that when it comes to something like cybersecurity, FERC is probably not the ideal agency to take lead on something that requires nimbleness and immediate reaction. The threats that are developed in cybersecurity...
You're suggesting that the U.S. government is nimble and...
well, I mean, just because they're nimbler than 5 rate makers, it's a comparative that I'm using here.
Yes.
That strikes me as being something that would be better for an executive agency like the Department of Energy, specifically when it comes to this subject. We have an Office of Energy Infrastructure Security that constantly deals with various jurisdictional entities, does best practices. Of course, on the gas side, none of that is mandatory. But I just question whether FERC itself would be the best agency to oversee cybersecurity directly.
Do you agree, though, that there should be greater oversight and standards for the pipeline system?
I do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Christie, earlier you mentioned in response, I think, to a question to Mr. Lankford, is that it's difficult to get folks to agree to permitting when they perceive that the line being permitted is for special interest. Can you elaborate who would be the special interest that somebody in Arkansas may perceive as the excuse for a transmission line?
Well, I think obviously developers, generation developers, transmission developers, and I'm not impugning anybody's motives, but the fact is if you build a transmission line, especially a high voltage line like a 765 kV, which is you have high towers, it goes, especially if they're greenfield, those are going to be extremely controversial and hundreds, even thousands of people are going to be opposed to those. Getting those built, and they're essential to build them, if they're needed for reliability, we absolutely need to build them. But the people who are naturally opposed to those very intrusive facilities, I think are going to be much more willing to accept that construction if they know, number one.
Well, let me ask you, because you said that earlier.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing, my perception, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have wind in the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma and you need to transmit it to Atlanta, the people in Arkansas are going to be wondering why is it coming, or the people in North Louisiana are going to be wondering why is it coming across my state, tearing up forests, wetlands, et cetera. Is that a correct kind of analysis of who are the players involved?
Well, without speaking to an individual line, I think you're right about the people in the middle between, the alpha and the omega of the line. If it's going to run from Oklahoma to or North Texas to Atlanta, people in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are going to wonder why a 765 kV is being driven straight through their state. That's just the reality.
Believe me, I get that. Mr. Glick, you had spoken in your testimony of trying to address the growing threat of extreme weather. My state has been impacted by that with multiple major transmission lines collapsed. What is FERC doing that people in my state will look at and say, my gosh, that's what FERC's doing to prevent us from having the consequences of extreme weather?
So I just want to point out, first of all, thank you for the question, Senator. I want to point out, first of all, that we have jurisdiction over the bulk power system and not necessarily the distribution system.
I get that.
And you understand that was where most of the issues were. But we do have authority, again, over the bulk power system. And one of the things we're doing is we're looking at the reliability standards that utilities currently operate under. What we learned from Winter Storm Uri in Texas and elsewhere is that there are significant gaps in terms of what utilities do and what they should be doing to ensure reliability. And given the fact that we're going to have increased occurrences of extreme weather, we need to ensure, and through our reliability standards, that utilities both plan for extreme weather in terms of enhancing their grid, making the transmission towers more resilient against 140-mile-an-hour storms that aren't necessarily going to be anomalies.
Is that FERC, or is that my local public service commission that's going to require those enhanced transmission lines?
It depends on the transmission line, and it's a little bit complicated, but some transmission facilities are considered part of the bulk power system, our responsibility. some more the local distribution
So
line.
those ones that are made like an erector set, which I'm told have a stronger wind profile, and after Hurricane Laura and Delta, Hurricane Laura and the more recent one, Ida, were collapsed, as opposed to the ones that look like a thin stick.
Yes.
Those stood up, these collapsed.
Yes.
Is that you or my Public Service Commission that would mandate an evaluation of whether or not those should be replaced?
Primarily your Public Service Commission. Obviously, it's a case-by-case basis, but primarily your Public Service Commission.
Okay. Okay. Then next, when you do the environmental impact of gas, I'll ask this to you, Mr. Chairman. There's evidence and there's a report out of a national lab here in the United States that both on a 20-year and a 100-year horizon, gas exported from the United States to Europe contributes significantly less to global greenhouse gas emissions than does Russian gas. Is this taken into account as this analysis is made of the environmental impact of our gas production upstream?
So the way the law is structured with regard to our approvals of LNG facilities, the Department of Energy is actually required to make the determination as to whether the export is in the public interest, and in doing so, they do an environmental analysis to determine whether the export of natural gas produces environmental benefits or adverse impacts. We are only, under the law, required to examine the construction and operation of the project, the emissions associated
And
with
one more
construction.
thing real quickly. I was told last night by somebody that does a pipeline, he could convert his compressors from gas to electric, and he could decrease his fugitive gas emissions, but it would take him so long to get the permit through Ferc, because he's constructing this now, originally at it with gas-powered compressors. It would take him so long to get that change through Ferc that it's not worth it, that he will tolerate the increased emissions precisely because of the regulatory delay. Now, is that an accurate kind of depiction of what he would confront should he ask that request to be made?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's helpful to make those requests. We consider those types of requests all the time. I think actually, if you look at our record, and I'll be glad to get you information for the record, I don't think the time we've taken to approve particular certificate applications is any much longer than they have been previously. We try to do it as quickly as possible. We have a lot of requests. We have to go through, under the law, we're supposed to go through various environmental analysis, but we actually try to move through it as quickly as possible. And even if I don't agree with the case in order, I still bring it up for a vote because I think that's our requirement, and I will continue to do so.
But how long would it take him to get that request through on average now?
I have to get you that information for the record. But it's, again, I think if you look at it based on previous chairs and our current approach, I don't think it's any different.
Thank you all.
Thank you. I'm aware that a vote has started, I think maybe more than 15 minutes ago, so we need to move fast. Did you have something you wanted to say quickly? Because Senator Murkowski has been waiting very, very patiently. So we have two members who have yet to ask questions. Yes, Senator, I thought maybe you had a choke.
Building transmission lines is going to be a huge issue. We have a referendum in Maine right now on a project for bringing hydropower from Canada to Massachusetts, and people in Maine are saying, why should we have the corridor? So you're absolutely right about that as a looming, I think, major issue.
Senator Murkowski.
Major issue. Love the fact that we have 4 of the Ferc commissioners with us, and we don't have protests, we don't have people screaming out in the halls. This is the calm new Ferc, so congratulations to you. But as Senator King has pointed out, many, many issues that generate their own level of controversy. I have been waiting patiently, Madam Chairman, and the beautiful thing is that I can hear the responses to the many good questions that colleagues have asked. Senator Daines raised the issue of hydro and the issues that we face with the Ferc in advancing our hydro projects. About 20% of Alaska's electricity on average comes from hydropower, but so much of ours is really small. I was out in the Eagle River Valley just last Saturday. There's a small project that one guy with a vision is developing. Juniper Creek, 300 kW came online. It's not much, but you can imagine the frustration of so many that are trying to get these really small projects online, recognizing that you have these multiple agencies that you've got to work through. And so I would love to figure out a way that we can get beyond, whether it's the efficiency issues, the multiple layers. Mr. Danley, those were your suggestions. I don't know if anybody else has anything that they can provide for the good of the order here on smaller scale, really smaller scale hydro, and what more we might be able to do to help advance some of these projects. Mr. Glick?
Thank you very much, Senator. So first of all, I want to say I agree wholeheartedly with what Commissioner Danley said earlier, that a lot of the issues associated with the speed, the length of time it takes to move hydro licensed projects is due to a lot to other agencies' involvements. But I would say that, we, pursuant to legislation that you all enacted a couple of years ago, we do have a pilot project with regard to pump storage. We do have a pilot project with regard to developing projects at 9 hydropower dams to try to expedite the process. And the problem is we haven't received too many applications yet, and we want to work with the hydro industry to do that. But I would also think that with regard to smaller projects, we need to consider maybe additional pilot projects, try to expedite the process along as much as we can at FERC, and try to work with our other agencies like the Interior Department and NIMS and so on, try to figure out how we can break the logjam.
Well, I like that idea, and I'm sure that we can provide you with some potential pilots. The issue of cybersecurity that has been raised by a couple, again, this is something that we're very keyed in on, but again, when you have really small utilities, we all know that we want greater oversight. We know that there needs to be standards, but sometimes with particularly your smaller entities, they don't have the upfront capital that is available. They can't make these investments. And so how do we address this? We've got a measure, Senator King and I, along with the chairman and Senator Risch, have this PROTECT Act that provides incentives for utilities to make the upgrades. Your comments on what more we can be doing when it comes to the smaller utilities, and really the very same threat that the big guys are facing, we face it down here, and it has a level of impact that is also just really debilitating. So comments to that.
So Senator,
Chairman?
if I can, and I appreciate the question. I spent quite a bit of time speaking with your, I think, member of your State Public Service Commission about this very issue. I know it's a very important issue. I think we need to revise the way we and NERC together look at cybersecurity threats. For instance, we had these high-value facilities and low-impact facilities and so on, and we've learned through this solar wind situation and so on that that's not necessarily the right metric, because low-impact facility, a foreign entity can get into a low-impact facility and then infiltrate a higher-impact facility associated with that. I think we need to take a look at where the threats are most likely to occur, and try to impose our standard and try to work our standards in a way that really focus more on that and less on these categories that I don't think work anymore. And I know that it's a big issue with smaller utilities, and I agree with you 100%. We also need to figure out a way to help these smaller utilities fund the investments, because the investments aren't going to go down. They're going to increase as time goes on.
And to penalize them when they don't have the capital up front, it's not that they don't want to, it's just that it's really challenging. One last quick question. The Alaska Gas Line Pipeline, FERC is very, very familiar with this project, having had it in front of it for years. Of course, we were pleased to see the project approved by the FERC last year. But throughout that, a lot of questions were highlighted. So I guess the last question for you, Chairman Glick, is you said in 2019 that, quote, FERC is obligated to consider greenhouse gas emissions and impacts to environmental justice communities. And so as you think about that in relation to the Alaska project, I guess the basic question is what are environmental justice communities, and do you think that it is just from an environmental or an economic perspective for these rural, very remote communities to continue to rely on their fuel source right now, which is very expensive diesel power generation? How does that work?
So thank you very much, Senator. First of all, we rely on EPA's regulations to determine what an environmental justice community is and isn't. With regard to your second question, we're required, whether it be an LNG facility or a natural gas pipeline, we're required to determine whether the project's essentially in the public interest. We look at the benefits of the project, against the potential adverse impacts to species or the environment or whatever else you're taking a look at. And those particular issues about increased access to cleaner fuel, economic development in the local community, those are the very type of issues that we consider on the benefit side of the ledger when we do a public interest analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Senator
Madam
Hogan.
Chairman.
Thank you, Acting Chairman Cantwell. For Commissioners Christie and Danley, what immediate action should the Commission take to make sure that the regional grid operators are retaining sufficient base load generated capacity, particularly during events that create stress on the grid?
I'm sorry, Senator, whom did you specify to take that action? The states or the commission?
Commission.
Okay, the commission's powers on the subject of generation are limited. The Federal Power Act restricts to the states and leaves that residual power to choose generation to them. Our powers relate to rate making, and we have to ensure, as I said in my opening comments, that the price signals in our markets properly compensate generators to retain the ones that already exist and attract new investment for new generation. But we do not directly select the generators.
So it's of no interest to you. Grid resiliency is totally up to the states. It's of no interest to you. There's nothing you should do about it.
So Senator Hoven, you and I have had this extended colloquy, and you and I both agree that there is a problem here. I think that if we march ahead with the change in the composition of the generation fleet as we have been, as it looks like we're doing, I think that resilience and reliability will be very badly impaired, and I think there will be catastrophic consequences.
I like that answer a lot better.
But that doesn't mean that I believe that FERC has the power, sir.
Well, I got that on the first question, or the first part of your answer.
Yes.
I got that. The second part, I think, is right on the money. Thank you for that, Commissioner.
Yes, Senator.
Commissioner Christie.
Well, Senator, if a state's not in an RTO, of course, it is up to the state. It is, the resource adequacy is up to the state, and even in the RTO, it's up to the state. Now, Mr. Danley's right. In those RTOs that set rules for where their capacity markets are going to run, those markets need to be non-discriminatory, non-preferential, and they also have to make sure that the planning is done to make sure that they have sufficient dispatchable resources to meet the need. You can't do it all with intermittent, but it's going to be a mix. And as we go through the transition, it's going to be a mix of both. But the RTOs have a much bigger role in that than obviously states that are not in RTOs.
Certainly the RTO has a role, no question about it. But grid, you would also share the concern that we have grid resiliency for efforts, for times it puts stress on the grid for the well-being of state, region, and country. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, reliability means, here's what it really means. It means the lights are on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Anything less than that is insufficient. That's not what Americans expect. And so we have to have a generation mix that can produce that 24/7, 365 standard.
Right on. So also for you two, should developers expect to complete a full environmental impact statement for new projects moving forward?
You mean a transmission developer?
Yes.
You know, I don't think we've had a case where that came up where the NEPA required a transmission developer. So I really don't want to comment on that since we haven't had and here's the thing, Senator. A transmission line is going to be permitted at the state level. And
well, it's my understanding that the chairman now is requiring an environmental impact for a project to move forward.
Well, that's for gas. I think, you know, gas is under our jurisdiction. I think
okay,
you were referencing
well, I'm sorry. I should have said, excuse me, for gas.
Yeah, transmission's under state permitting. You know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For gas.
Well, that gets back to what the Natural Gas Act requires and also what NEPA requires, and that's an ongoing.
Should FERC require an EIS for a gas pipeline?
I think FERC ought to require what the law requires. Now, whether an EIS is required in every case, I can't give you a definitive answer on that because it's still, frankly, under litigation.
So you're saying it's not up to FERC? They shouldn't require an EIS for a gas pipeline?
I can't say in every case that it's required because that's something that's under litigation right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Danley?
What is required under the implementing regs for NEPA is that if there is a significant impact, then an EIS is required, but an EA can do the initial review to determine the severity of the impact. And so in conducting all NEPA under the CEQ regs, there is a rule of reason that compels the action of the agency, and you do as little work as you possibly can to get the fastest answer from government you can get.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that answer. Chairman Glick.
I could just respond quickly. So I think Chairman Danley, Commissioner Danley is correct in terms of how he characterizes the law. I think the problem is that the courts keep on telling us that we keep on getting it wrong. And we're not expediting things. What we're doing is delaying things. Because every time we're supposed to perform an EIS and we prepare an EAA, we just ignore climate change altogether. The courts say, you got it wrong, you got to do it all over again. That costs billions of dollars and extra time for these pipeline projects. And I think certainty is much more important than trying to decide whether we can do something quickly and do it on the cheap. Every time we do it on the cheap, the courts tell us we got it wrong.
In that context, then, I mean, it takes much longer now to permit these gas pipeline projects than it does to build them. Can you help expedite that? Because we have situations where it's in everybody's interest, including better environmental stewardship, to build a pipeline. We've got to be able to do it.
And we are attempting to expedite the process, Senator, and thank you for the question. I think one of the things is we had a discussion about this several months ago. We were trying to prepare supplemental environmental impact statements where we see holes as opposed to drafting a whole new big environmental impact statement on everything. We're moving forward as quickly as we can. Some of these projects are moving forward, and we'll be considering them very shortly. But again, if we cut corners, all the courts are going to tell us to do is go back to the drawing board.
But it is your intent to try to get these things done properly, but as expeditiously as we can.
Everything before us as expeditiously as possible. That's my motto.
Thank you.
Senator,
appreciate it.
Can I say one thing on this subject, which is that there is a difference between a failure by an agency to properly conduct a NEPA review, which would be in the EA or the EIS, and a problem from the agency from an Administrative Procedure Act standpoint to properly explain the decisions that it made, partially informed by that NEPA document. In almost all of the cases where FERC has been, in one way or another, remanded, those cases are not because of failures in the NEPA document. They are failures of reasoning under the Administrative Procedure Act. It's basically the court saying, you did not sufficiently explain the reason why you made this choice, connecting the choice made to the facts found. And so saying that we can fix that problem of APA violations by having different or more robust NEPA review is simply not the reality of the remands we've gotten from the courts. And I feel it's necessary to tell the committee that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Danley. Also, I have some questions for Commissioner Clements, but I'll submit the rest for the record in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, and I do thank all of you for your responses. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Hoeven. Just another number of quick questions. Commissioner Danley, my understanding that both private and public investors build and operate electricity, natural gas projects in accordance with a whole series of contracts, and you mentioned that earlier. These contracts determine how, whether, and when a project can be built, when it can be turned on, continue to operate. So if Congress enacts this so-called Clean Electricity Performance Program, as House Democrats have proposed, what is the likely impact on existing contracts?
Thank you, Senator. So you're asking the current contractual relationships, right? So I alluded earlier to what I thought the consequences of this legislation would be for the markets, but for the entire rest of the country that isn't in markets, that's governed by a series of very complicated interacting bilateral, multilateral contracts, usually that are entered into for very long periods of time, decades. If the revenues that people can expect if they meet the performance standards or the penalties that they can expect if they fail to meet them then get applied to those contract holders, you're going to find that a huge number of parties and counterparties will either be unable to perform under the contract terms and then suffer the penalties specified, or they may actually find that rational breach of those contracts is in their business interest, and then they will intentionally not fulfill those contracts because they have separate revenue streams that will be more lucrative to them. That is the ineluctable effect of the market forces that will be created.
So then it's fair to say that this legislation, which the Democrats are proposing in the House, would result in a tidal wave of disputes, lawsuits, and ultimately hurt American consumers and the economy.
Yeah, as I said before, nobody has a crystal ball, but it seems like that can be expected. Look, one way or another, the point is, if the legislation goes into effect as written, the consequences are going to be profound, they're going to be disruptive, and at the moment, they're basically incalculable. And I think it's worth pointing out, and I don't want to make this sound like a plea for mercy, but even though we have virtually no role in implementing any of what's in that bill, FERC, as a practical matter, is going to be the forum in which all of those disputes are going to be adjudicated when it comes to our jurisdictional contracts. I mean, there will be residual state contract issues, of course, but FERC is going to have to do a lot of the cleanup for what I think is the inevitable consequences of this.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Chairman Glick, I agree with you. Safeguarding the reliability of the electric grid should be one of FERC's top priorities. Enabling power plants to have access to to plentiful supplies of natural gas is essential to electric reliability. So if FERC fails to permit new natural gas pipelines or upgrades of existing pipelines in a timely and a predictable manner, wouldn't that put electric reliability at risk?
Thank you for the question, Senator Barrasso. So, first of all, I think that you can't answer the question generally because you have to take these issues on a case-by-case basis. But there are several cases in which the courts, most recently in the Spire case, in which the court told us if a project's not needed, that's one of our responsibilities. FERC is supposed to ensure that there's sufficient natural gas and sufficient natural gas transportation capacity around the country. But one of the things the statute tells us, natural gas tells us, is the project needed? And so first of all, that's what we have to determine, whether there's a need for the project and not based on some sort of contract between affiliates, whether there's true need for the project. And if, in that case, I will on a case-by-case basis determine that if there is, in fact, evidence in the record to suggest that additional natural gas capacity is needed for reliability reasons, I will then, personally, I will conclude that the project is needed.
So, Mr. Danley, recent events in California and Texas have shown that reliable, affordable natural gas is essential for families to heat and power their homes, their state, local governments to provide public services, Americans to operate their businesses. Are you concerned that the Commission's failure to act on pending applications for natural gas pipeline certificates will put reliable, affordable prices for electricity and natural gas services at risk?
Yes, Senator, and it's not only the fact that there is a delay in a handful of the cases pending, it's also the uncertainty created by the recent issuances by the Commission.
And Chairman Glick, again, and I have a series of just general statements for you that don't pertain to any particular matter before you, but please just let me know if you agree or disagree. Private sector investors who put up their own money and expect a reasonable return finance most long-term energy infrastructure in the U.S. Agree or disagree?
Agreed.
Okay. And the Commission's obligation is to balance the needs and interests of investors and the public. Agree or disagree?
Agreed.
Okay. Investors need regulatory certainty. Agree or disagree?
Wholeheartedly agree.
And the Commission introduces uncertainty for investors if it calls into question its final orders, especially final orders which have been upheld on appeal.
Well, if orders have been upheld on appeal, that's one thing. I think when the Commission hasn't ever done that. But if the Commission does question, if the courts question what the Commission has done and says that there's not sufficient, the Commission didn't do something sufficiently, whether it be a NEPA review or a need finding, we're actually creating the exact typical, we're actually discouraging investors from investing in the market because they have no certainty. That's why we need to do it right the first time.
And final question, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Danley, as you noted in your prepared remarks, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that the principal purpose of the Natural Gas Act is to encourage, quote, the orderly development of plentiful supplies of electricity and natural gas at reasonable prices. Court has ascribed the same purpose to the Federal Power Act. In your view, is the Commission doing all that it can to fulfill the purpose of these two statutes, and if not, what more should the Commission be doing?
I think, Senator, that the Commission is failing to properly oversee our markets to produce the correct signals that will incentivize the arrival of much-needed generation in various regions. And then also I think that we are creating a climate of uncertainty that makes it impossible to rationally deploy capital to build out the natural gas infrastructure that the electric system and people need.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No further questions.
Thank you, Senator. And my question, final two questions, would be to whoever would want to respond on these, okay? But I believe that all of you agree that more regional and interregional transmission lines will be needed to facilitate clean energy, improve the grid resilience and reliability. The recently noticed rulemaking on transmission planning confirms that. But yet FERC recently reversed course and has proposed sunsetting after 3 years the return on investment the adder transmission owners can access as an incentive to join the regional transmission organization, the RTOs. So the incentive adder was directed by Congress as part of the Energy Policy of Act of 2005, as a compromise short of mandating RTO membership. That was the sweetener. Joining RTO remains voluntarily, but I know that PJM and other grid operators are concerned that eliminating this sweetener will mean transmission owners may elect not to join or stay in the RTO, which could significantly reduce reliability benefits that RTOs can provide and do provide. So Anyone have that same concern that I have? Yes, sir, Chairman Glick.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, so I think you're exactly correct. The statute, which was enacted in 2005, tells FERC to give incentives to transmission owners that join RTOs. And I think there are significant benefits with RTOs and consumer savings, reliability, resilience, all the rest. But the incentive is only to join. And if we provide an incentive 20 years later, if we continue to provide the same 50 basis point, 100 basis point adder 20 years later, that's no longer becomes an incentive. We're also supposed to, you mentioned earlier, affordability. We have to guard and ensure that consumers are adequately protected. I think if Congress wanted to amend the law and say that you should provide an incentive for staying in an RTO and being in an RTO, that's one thing. But I think the way the statute is written currently, we have no choice but to cut off the incentive at some point.
So, Senator Manchin, the language of the statute is to give incentives to utilities that join. That is a demonstrative. It's not a to join. And further, the statute specifies that we're supposed to do as much as we can. I mean, it was very broadly written, as much as we can.
That join or to join?
It says that join. It identifies.
So that's all new. That's not existing. That's new.
No. It means those that join should be given the incentive. And so having this idea that it's appropriate to limit it, I don't understand. I dissented vigorously on this. If you want to have RTO membership and what you Congress want to do is encourage it, it's worth keeping in mind two things. It's not only an inducement for people to join, but it's also an inducement for people to remain. And as long as the utilities have the privilege of exiting RTOs, the limit on the RTO adder is going to encourage an earlier exit, all things being equal. So I think it's very bad for the project of trying to encourage utilities to join and remain.
You think the language of the code needs to be changed?
Chairman Manchin, there's a practical aspect to this. We have two responsibilities under the Federal Power Act. One is to retain reliability, and one is to protect customers.
Right.
We should be incenting things that are hard to do so that when we are building out our system, we're protecting customers in the process. As you described this RTO adder, a sweetener, it's not hard to join an RTO. In fact, RTOs have been saving customers billions of dollars year after year after year for several decades now. We should be thinking about what are the things that are really hard to get done? What are the things that we need to help utilities do that require incentives? Once you've been in an RTO past some number of years, it's not hard to keep saving customers money. So I think the important piece to talk about is how do we get the hard things done?
Is there more incentive for them to move on? Is it more profitable for an RTO to move on to independence, basically, for profit reasons?
I wouldn't, vouch to speak for any particular utility, but my guess would be no, and I think certainly the utility commissions and governors of states where those RTOs or utilities live might have something to say about
Commissioner
that.
Christie.
I would say this, Mr. Chairman. On the issue of whether the law actually requires an RTO adder as opposed to an incentive, I would agree with the chairman on this. I don't think it mandates an RTO adder specifically. I think it's incentives generally. And I would say this. There's not a utility in America in an RTO that isn't there because either A, the state mandated it, or B, they went to their state, the utility went to their state regulators and asked to join, as our utilities in Virginia asked to join PJM. So they made a decision to join the RTO, and the problem I've got with an adder, and I'm not going to prejudge the case because it's actually still open, but an ROE is the cost of capital. It's the market cost of equity. And so an adder, by definition, is above the market cost of equity. And who pays that? Consumers pay that. And, your opening remarks, you talked about the need to be sensitive to consumers, and I take that very seriously. And I think that is implicated here when you talk about an adder to an ROE, because consumers are going to pay it.
You all have any consensus? Right now you don't, but do you have a way to have a consensus of a language change, code change, things of that sort, that would keep people in the RTO? You don't believe, I understand three of you do not believe they're going to leave the RTO.
Do not believe what, Senator?
That RTOs are going to exit. They're not going to exit. Okay. You all three believe that won't happen because there's too much incentive and benefits to the consumers.
I don't agree with my colleagues. I think that there is an ever-growing chance that RTOs will unravel and that the transmission or owners will leave. I'm not saying that's going to happen imminently, but I think it's getting closer.
Then I would assume that let's use Texas as the model of what we should be looking not to do, right? We all agree on that. Texas being
I wouldn't structure my energy market the way Texas does. No, sir.
No, I know that, but I'm saying basically what happened with Texas was no reliability, no backup, not hooked in, no oversight. Maybe we could have caught that. Maybe we could have stopped that and prevented it. I would think they have a hard time exiting right now, because for their own benefit, whatever it may be. I don't know. But
In this increasing new normal of extreme weather that hits all of our states,
Sure.
the idea of not being interconnected to your neighboring systems
Right.
through coordinated integration that both allows for the sharing of resources that saves customers money and protects customers in these dangerous situations is a really compelling reason to stay connected.
Commissioner Danley, then I would ask you, what would be the incentive then if all these risks are out there if they leave?
Well,
Since the sweetener goes away.
What would be the incentive for them to leave? It's
Right.
that the burdens of being a transmission owner within an RTO are simply too high to justify remaining. They would have to pay a whole lot of money to leave. This we've seen before when utilities have left RTOs. But if RTOs are so great and everybody wants to be part of them, why are there entire regions of the country that have simply refused to even consider the idea? I think we can see in front of us empirically that the promises of RTOs make sense for some regions and not for others. And to the extent to which Congress wishes to incentivize utilities to join them, it has to actually take action to, otherwise it would have happened.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, we only give the incentive to actually utilities that voluntarily join an RTO. If a state tells them to join an RTO, they're not eligible for the incentive pursuant to court decision. And all the utilities that are required.
If I was still governor, I would tell mine that I'm not mandating you, just go ahead and do it and get the money.
But in some states like Ohio, for instance, those where the state requires you to participate in RTO,
Sure.
we don't see anyone leaving. I mean, basically,
They can't if he
right,
mandates it.
they can't, but they also provide. They also talk about all the benefits they get from participating in the
Sure.
RTO, and I don't think we'd see anyone leaving.
It's a good discussion, and I can understand that your discussions could be lively. That's good. Maybe we need a fifth one here, huh? Real quick.
Absolutely.
Let me just thank you all. You all been most professional, and I appreciate it, and I think most amicable, and I think there's a good collegiate mix here. It really is, and that's good. Mr. Danley, I know that you're kind of on the fringes on the other side, and that's good too. We need, and I mean that. I mean, trust me, I know how you feel. So I'm saying that with all reference.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
But the bottom line is we've got to find consensus and move forward. And I'm concerned about, I think, the clean energy standard. You all kind of, I'm not asking you to comment on it. I'm telling you my concerns I have. That when we start paying utilities to do what I think they're going to do anyway. I looked at the transitions going on now. What's happened since 2000 to 2020, we've transitioned to a complete different delivery system. And we did not pay the utilities to do it. It's profit making. And so you know where I'm coming from, if they're going to do anything with utilities and transmission, I know a little bit about the transmission. There's an awful lot of money to be made in transmission, probably more money in transmission is in production. And with that being said, then if you want to build a line, you better share a little bit of the resources. Don't give me everyone stopping you, because I put in a procedure called kilowatt mile. So we would basically share with the counties or the municipalities we went through to build a line and just share the revenues. Takes care of all the problems. Everybody's benefits in that. But now this going out to the new areas, I'm not understanding the connectivity from the standpoint. I said, I'll give you a loan. Federal government should give a loan to go out in the desert for wind, solar, whatever it may be. But there should be a period of time when that's going to end up being profitable. I'm taking all the risk away from the front end of financial. But until it's interconnected and starts making money, then the Treasury should get its money back. That's the only thing I have said. They want to give it just strictly as a grant up front. And that to me makes no sense whatsoever. And I just can't, for the life of me, keep writing checks from our Treasury to publicly traded companies that have shareholders that are basically benefiting off of the investments we're making with no return to the taxpayers. That's the biggest problem I have. So I'll be calling on y'all to help me through this and seeing if there's a way. But I want to build out. If it's there, customers are demanding it. Energy will be needed. I think the statement was made. I'm not sure which one. I think, Ms. Christie, you made the statement, and I agree wholeheartedly, that if we give them and pay them incentives to basically change their portfolio by 2030, reliability be the loser. Reliability could be the big loser because we're moving faster than what it is. And I guarantee the utilities will take every dime you want to give them, but they will not commit and basically be held accountable for liability. And then they're going to have to buy it somewhere, and the consumer's going to pay. That's my problem. That is my big problem. And You know, in my state, you hit it, what are we going to do, 93% on coal? I've said this, if a coal plant doesn't have scrubbers, low NOx boilers, baghouses for mercury, they shouldn't be operating. That technology is available. Until we can do carbon capture and find out a way that we have utilization through some type of technology that we come up with that makes it feasible, it makes it very difficult. But there's not that many states like mine, I don't believe, left, is there? You all would know that better. PG,
I think West Virginia has the highest percentage of coal, no question.
that's what I'm saying. So our transition is going to be much different. But I can tell you, the transition is going to happen, and people in West Virginia realize that. Just don't leave us behind. There's got to be something. We can do something. So I'm trying to get the legislature in West Virginia just to change their code so we can build nuclear. I have a perfect platform for nuclear, basically where the old coal-fired plant was. Transmission, everything's connectivity is there, and we can't even do that yet. So we've all got to get together, but you all can be tremendous. You all have an extreme amount of knowledge on this, and I think you have the desire. All of you seem to have that passion and desire. I see it coming out when everybody wants to jump up, and that's all good. That's really good. And we hope we can get you another Ferc nominee as quickly as possible. There'll be 5 of you that will be a full working Ferc. So with that being said, I want to thank you all again. Appreciate it very much. And our members will have until close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. Committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.